Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Higher Ed Live. Great to be back with you again tonight. I'm Ryan Catherwood, coming to you from the grounds of the University of Virginia here in Charlottesville. Tonight, we have an absurdly good show. I feel comfortable telling you that it's going to be absurdly good. But if you're watching right now, you probably already know that we've got some amazing guests from the world of advancement and alumni engagement on the show tonight. Andy Shaindlin, Andrew Gossen, and Charlie Melichar are here tonight. I have to admit I am a little bit nervous, and I'll probably settle down the jitters here from a moment, but these guys are some heavy hitters. So, you know, it's important to put the best foot forward here. We got a show planned for you, but we'll see how on track we stay for it. There's no doubt in our format tonight that's sort of a roundtable discussion about engagement issues that we may pivot one direction or another. But I'm going to do my best to steer a nice thread through the conversation, and if we get off track, that's totally okay with me. But Charlie, Andy, and Andrew, how are we doing tonight, fellas?
Great. Excellent.
Good. Fantastic. Thanks so much for coming on the show tonight. Really appreciate it. A couple of weeks ago, I read Andy's piece on alumni futures called The Risk of Measuring Alumni Engagement and thought it would make a great framework for a show. I always like to find a piece of blog content in order to focus our conversation. I thought it was a great piece. I didn't necessarily think Andy was going to agree to be on the show tonight, but we're thrilled to have him here. Before I further introduce our guests, let me tell you a little bit about the sponsors for the show. Omni Update is sponsor for Higher Ed Live, and Omni Update is the leading web content management system CMS provider for higher education. The company's web CMS, OU Campus, is secure and scalable with great tools and features, deployment flexibility, and an awesome user community. Going to AACC 2013 or Higher Ed Web Florida, stop by the Omni Update booth and say hello to Mario Leniello and at @J_Rex. We're tweeting the link out right now. Integral, Higher Ed Live is also sponsored by Integral, the creators of the Schools app, a private Facebook community to boost enrollment and retention. Check out their blog, Integral Insights, for posts and admissions marketing, student engagement, and social media in higher education. Okay, back to the guests, guys. Let me introduce my trio. Actually, they were called the Trinity of Alumni Engagement this week when we were promoting the show, which I thought was really great. Andy Shaindlin is the 24-year veteran of higher education advancement. Most of you know Andy, and former trustee of CASE, Council for Support of Education. He's the founder of the website Alumni Futures. Most of us bookmark that. He writes, he speaks, he sometimes consults on issues related to alumni relations, technology, and education. And he's got a great job as the Associate Vice President for Alumni Relations and Annual Giving at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. Charlie Melichar is Associate Vice Chancellor for Development and Alumni Relations Communications at Vanderbilt. It's a position he's held since 2010. He's a former Vice President for Public Relations and Communications at Colgate and Director of Media Relations at the University of Maryland. We also have Andrew Gossen, and he's the Director, Senior Director, that is, for Social Media Strategy in the Division of Alumni Affairs, and the Senior Director for Social Media Strategy in the Division, I just read that twice. It's the Division of Alumni Affairs and Development at Cornell University. These things happen when you have a script. He joined Cornell in early 2010 to spearhead the integration of social media and mobile technology into the division's strategic plan. Previously, Andrew spent 8 years at the Alumni Association of Princeton University in a number of different roles. He also has served CASE on the Commission of Alumni Relations, was co-chair along with Charlie of the CASE Joint Commission Task Force on Social Media, and chaired the 2011 CASE Social Media Community Conference. As I said, we got a couple of heavy hitters on the show tonight. Andy, let's get right to it. If you could tell us a little bit about your piece in Alumni Futures, The Risk of Measuring Alumni Engagement, and what it was about the current environment that made you challenge the way we think about measuring alumni engagement.
Sure. Well, first of all, Ryan, thank you for featuring the article from my blog and inviting me to be on the show. I really enjoy having these kinds of conversations with people like Charlie and Andrew who have a lot to say about it. The article and the topic was really sort of the product of the convergence of 2 or 3 things that happened over the winter. I was asked to give a talk at Case 7 in San Francisco in February, and one of the suggestions was, well, alumni engagement is a hot topic, maybe you could focus on that. And it wasn't like a presentation, it was like a TED Talk format, like 12 minutes, everything we need to know about alumni engagement. You know? So that was a challenge, and I was thinking about the basics. At the same time, I was reading a book that I mentioned in the article on the blog, What Are Universities For? Is the name of the book. It's by a Cambridge University professor, Stefan Collini, who talks about the difficulty of metrics and quantitative measurement in his field, which is the humanities. And I thought, well, you know, we have a real hard time sometimes using quantitative measurement in alumni relations, and maybe there's something there that relates to this. And that book actually has a lot of insight that I think I learned from. And then the third thing was just in my day-to-day work, like all of us, we are constantly fighting for resources, trying to get budget money, trying to get staff support, and to do that, we really have to show that our efforts are paying off in some tangible way. So there's a very strong pressure, I think, on a lot of alumni relations offices to show a direct connection between alumni relations input and fundraising or revenue-based outcomes. And I think that that pressure is one of the things that's driving a lot of alumni directors to say, I better start measuring stuff, I better start quantifying, I better use numerical systems, because otherwise it's going to be really hard for me to show that what I'm doing relates to the thing that the vice president or the chancellor or the president or the head of school really cares about. So all of those things kind of, it was like a perfect storm in my head, and I just tried to get some thoughts about that out in the form of that blog post and the talk.
Yeah, and it was a fantastic piece. Let me toss it over to Andrew with the idea of talking about validating our work in alumni engagement to our institution, to our colleagues. Alumni engagement's a part of every university. What does this say that we're still talking about how to measure it? And I think, Andrew, in our prep work for the show, you were actually talking about how, you know, it's alumni engagement, as we know, it's not actually a part of institutions overseas.
That's true. In terms of validating our work, I think we need to be upfront and honest about the fact that the pressure to validate our work in this way is going to vary a little bit depending on what our institution is like and the way that our advancement operation is configured. For instance, when I worked at Princeton, there's a very clear division between the alumni affairs side of the house and the fundraising side of the house, and that's deliberate. And asking questions about how alumni relations impacts the fundraising side of the house is something that simply doesn't make sense in that context. By contrast, at Cornell, there is a very conscious and deliberate effort to blur the boundaries between the two sides of the house, if not do away with them altogether. And that's posing us with a different series of questions that we need to ask. Having experienced both, I don't think that one is necessarily better than the other, but the pressure that Andy referenced is certainly real. And if in a tactical way, in that we have to recognize the realities of the environment in which we're working, and if in fact there is pressure from various different points higher up in the org chart than we sit to deliver these sort of metrics, I would argue that at a very pragmatic level it may not matter that much whether or not we truly believe in the fact that measuring is important. If the people we report to believe that the measuring is important, we don't have a heck of a lot of traction to push back against them on that front. And especially when we start thinking about making requests for additional resources, which is a habitual concern in my particular area, which has to do with online engagement and digital media. there's no way in the world we can make that case unless we can quantify what we've done, use that data to speculate about what could be done with the investment of additional resources, line those possibilities up with existing strategic and organizational priorities, and then make a case that we can actually use these tools to advance the overall organizational goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Charlie, to follow up on that or kind of comment on it, do you indeed see that pressure to vie for resources and validate the work you're doing from an alumni engagement standpoint?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I come from a communications background, so that's kind of the lens I view everything from. And I think in a lot of ways, communications and alumni relations, alumni engagement are kind of dipping in the same pot of soup here, in that people don't necessarily understand sometimes the outcomes, and the outcome can be something very tangible, like PR could be a news clip, and for alumni relations, it can be it can get converted into dollars. Did this event relate to a fundraising effort? I think the institutional call for measurement is a good thing. I think that it gives all of us, no matter what part of the organization we're working in, an opportunity to educate people about why we do what we do, why we do it in a certain way, why it's different from other things we would do. And I think once you get past that, you can have better conversations about why doing more or less of something is a good thing. Because if we just look at it through the lens of, well, I need more resources to do this thing, someone can easily say, well, we don't need to do that thing, or how does that thing affect my thing? I think once we educate about why we do it the way we do it, and why we might need to either change in a certain way or add more or subtract a little bit, it gives us the opportunity to be much more nimble, and we have to have less conversations about why we're doing a certain thing, because there's a little bit of a better understanding about the why.
Andy, I was looking at the bios for you guys before the show, and I definitely noticed that all three of you gentlemen have a component of development in the title of the division under which you work. Your title, Andy, is Alumni Relations and Annual Giving. Right. Under the advancement umbrella, are we just sort of the long road to fundraising, or should we be thinking of alumni engagement differently?
Well, I mean, fundraising or giving by alumni is a form of engagement. It's an outcome also of other forms of engagement. So, you can find the correlation fairly easily between the likelihood or the frequency or the scale of giving by people who have attended events more than others, or who have volunteered compared with others who have not. So the forms of engagement that we tend to associate with alumni relations traditionally, event attendance, volunteerism, and advocacy or showing pride, those are correlated to giving behavior. And so you can't think of them as being completely separate. And I think that, you mentioned my job title. I've been in this position for 2 years now, or just about 2 years. The alumni relations and annual giving components, until I got here 2 years ago, were separate. And the annual giving director didn't report to the associate VP for alumni relations. She reported to the associate VP for development. And so I think that one thing I've noticed a lot over the last 2 years, maybe others have a different perception, but I see a lot more and more alumni relations and annual giving offices being put either side by side or overlapping in terms of staff structure under one senior leader who has responsibility for not only the traditional alumni relations activities, but the annual giving activities as well. That's partly a pressure of a result of the pressure I referred to earlier, which is, well, how does alumni relations relate to giving? But it's also, frankly, I think, an evolutionary understanding that, well, these things really are tied together, and it's okay for them to be together. It's not going to terrify anybody. Alumni assume, as soon as you say you're from the alumni office, you assume you're actually going to ask them for a gift, or that what you really do is fundraising. So nobody's shocked to discover that these things are adjacent to each other in the organization. So, I think it's okay. I think they're related. I think it makes sense. That's not to say that alumni engagement without the giving component has no value. It clearly does, because those kinds of things support the institution and the alumni in ways other than financial support. And that's important too. So we need all of these things. They all come under the engagement umbrella. They all come under the advancement umbrella. And I think that that's much more well accepted and more well recognized now than it was, say, even, you know, 8 or 10 years ago.
What do you think, Andrew? Do you read it the same way Andy does? Sort of the fundamental long road to fundraising is almost assumed and recognized even amongst the alumni we serve?
I very much do agree, and we've recently undergone a reorg in which Alumni Affairs, Annual Fund, and Affinity Fundraising have all been brought together under the same Associate VP. That makes a lot of sense to me because it feels to me like that was the direction in which all of these areas were evolving already. And to recognize that reality in our org structure makes a heck of a lot of sense. And it opens up an interesting range of possibilities, which I will get to in just a second. But I think this is a good time to highlight the fact that a lot of the pressure that we're talking about is emerging not only from this internal sense that we need to be better about measuring what we do and relating our efforts to specific business outcomes, but it's also a function of increasing external pressure and competition for the time and the talent and the treasure of our alumni on the part of an emerging breed of extraordinarily nimble, agile, aggressive, techno-savvy nonprofits that aren't burdened by the same legacy organizational structures that we are that keep us from being able to be quite as responsive and nimble and agile. And I think that blurring of these boundaries between these various different areas and recognition that we're all working with the same audience towards the same greater institutional goals is something that we have to do if we're going to be able to compete long term with this new environment.
One of the first time I hosted Higher Ed Live, we talked about competition with respect to the alumni networks, and I like where you're going with that thought in terms of we do need to be nimble and be thinking about the ways that we're building relationships and making good use of the valuable time associated with our alumni and parents and friends of the university. So in Charlie, in building these networks, you know, what's more important? Are we thinking about how the alumni are going to build the network for themselves from these opportunities, or are we thinking more about the institution building a broad alumni network?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think sometimes it's something we end up struggling with in this field, and I like to simplify things, and because I'm simple, and I think there's value in understanding when you need to build something and when you need to just bring the hammer or just kind of be there. And because of the models that we used to work under, we had to build a lot of things. You know, we were a central resource for connectivity. We had a lot of resources that people kind of on their own in the network just didn't. And because of social media, because of a lot of things, a lot of those tools are out there already, and people can build their own networks, sustain their own networks, and they might just be by virtue of the fact that they have a common affinity because of their degree, and we don't have to do much, and that's good. And there are other places where we bring it up to the table, whether it's structure, whether it's resources, intellectual capital, where it makes sense for institutions to organize them or to really manage them. But I think there's value in taking a step back and saying both of these things are good and they're different, and they all contribute to a sense of vitality around the alumni body. So I think there's a little bit of both in there, that it's worth kind of respecting what each brings to the game and having those conversations with alumni, because we can't just assume because we do this all day, they kind of know what the rules of engagement are, that if we say, you know, here are the kind of things that we think are good, and we encourage you to do these things, and here's the things we're going to do. And there might be points where we kind of hand something off or kind of give more control or pull some back. I think that's a good thing because it's a more transparent conversation, and it emphasizes that at the end of the day we care about the network, and it has a lot of different manifestations.
Andy, would you agree with that take that we have to work even harder now to help to build these networks and help alumni build their own networks so that they're growing professionally and personally underneath the umbrella of the university?
I think the way I think of it is, I'm not sure if I agree or disagree. You can decide. I would characterize it sort of this way. I think building the network maybe isn't the verb I would use. The way I think of it is that the network exists. It's latent in the form of this connection that Charlie referred to. You know, we have this shared educational institution in our background. What we have to do is not necessarily build this network. It's already there. We have to activate it. We have to make it accessible. We have to create a way that makes it easy for a student or an alum to understand what the network is and why it has potential value to them. You know, can help them solve some problem, for example. They're looking for a job. They're looking for an employee. They're looking for venture capital. They're changing careers. They're deciding about grad school. Network can help with all those things. How do I access the network? And then secondly, the role of the institution isn't so much as this kind of parent that oversees or controls or even influences the network. I think the role of our offices and us as individual professionals in advancement is to participate as additional members of that network in a way that adds value, because we're so connected through the nature of our work to many people with many resources, many experiences, that we have a way to add value to the individual alum to help them solve that problem by connecting them with the resource that they need and then getting out of the way and letting them take advantage of their place in the network. I think, you know, Charlie did hint at something really critical. Alumni can create, activate, and sort of visualize their networks by themselves much more effectively now partially because of social media, which Charlie mentioned. I actually think the one technology tool that has had the biggest influence over alumni networks isn't necessarily social media platforms. I think it's powerful internet search, and the fact that if I want to find out, hey, whatever happened to Charlie, that guy I went to college with, 10 years ago or 12 years ago, I would have had to call the alumni office and buy a directory and look it up and hope that the info was maybe less than 5 years out of date. Now, I go to Google, LinkedIn, Facebook, and in 10 seconds, I can find Charlie. And I don't really need the institution to do that for me. So we don't have the central role we used to have in forging those connections, but we do still have the opportunity to make the network visible and accessible.
I think, I mean, just to build on that a little bit, I think that is such an important point, and there's a flexibility there of saying, well, we used to do this, and here's what we used to do, and that was really important and valuable, and now we need to do this. Mm-hmm. You don't leave work one day and make that transition the next. I think there's a level of understanding and nimbleness around making that transition to, we used to be the container, and now we're the content, that is just, it's kind of a big deal. And the content thing, again, being a communications guy, is really important to me, because I think the one thing that we do that we have when you turn the lights on in the morning is intellectual capital. We've got this resource that brought people together in the first place, and then whether they're 1, 3, 5, or 50 years out, can somehow be a point of connection. We talk a lot about the connection alumni have to each other, but we're searching around for what the connection is back to the institution. I think we have to talk about that, the love of learning, the lifelong learning, kind of the touching something inside people that has to do with stimulating their intellectual curiosity, and of course the career network and all those other things, but it's something that we just have, and I think we need to figure out that transition so we bring something kind of deep to the conversation that's beyond, as Andy was saying, kind of the functional stuff.
And that's interesting, right? Because then all of a sudden we're talking about value. And value is incredibly tricky in that value can be highly contextual. Andy was alluding to this. A latent network may not be important until you really need it. I personally had an experience that really illustrated this for me this past fall when I had a family member, and we really needed to get some really expert medical help really fast. And fortunately, everything worked out well. But that was the first time that I had to really punch my networks hard and try to get something out of them. And the effectiveness with which that worked was really a very powerful thing. And understanding that at a time when you really need help, you can turn to these networks, and that getting an answer back sort of substantiates and justifies not only all of my past investment of time and money and effort in my relationship with these institutions, but also a lot of additional investment in the future. So that's totally contextual. It would never have been apparent to me if this situation had not arisen, but then you ask yourself, well, how can we make other alumni aware that this latent value is there waiting to be activated should the need arise for them to tap into that? That's a really interesting question for me. But then I start thinking about value, right? Value is subjective. Each different individual alum's perception of value may vary considerably depending on where they are in life, whatever their current needs are, their current context, so on and so forth. If we're talking about engagement and measuring engagement, and we're talking about value, to what extent do we need to start trying to think about how we measure alumni perceptions of value as we measure the success of our engagement efforts, as opposed to relying solely on criteria that make sense for us sitting within the organizations and the silos and the business processes that we inhabit?
Yeah, and Andrew, maybe we're talking here about why people are not involved in the network, or choose not to be engaged. Is that the real measurement that would, validate our efforts in terms of building the network?
I think that it might, at the very least, talking to the people who are not engaged, however we define engagement. For Cornell, we define engagement in terms of a combination of giving, volunteering, and attending events. If we're trying to tease out what value is for this particular community, we not only need to do the qualitative and quantitative research that helps us understand why people do engage, but also invest an equal amount of energy in figuring out why the value proposition is not there for that other large percentage of people who don't have any antipathy towards the institution, but simply aren't seeing a reason why it's worth their time and energy to focus. And I don't see how we can develop a nuanced and multidimensional sense of the impact of our engagement if we can't engage with questions like that.
Yeah. And I think that most institutions, Charlie, are heavily reliant on the attendance metric as far as measuring the success of their alumni engagement efforts. Is attendance powerful enough? Or does it need to be complemented in other ways as far as measuring?
I think it's a component. I mean, we look at things through the same lens that Andrew's just talking about. Through engagement means a bunch of different things, and events certainly are a powerful piece of that, because it means someone's raising their hand, they're taking their time and saying, I want to come do this thing on your terms if you're hosting the event. So it indicates something. To me, one of the key indicators is its relevance. So if people thought that the thing you're doing is relevant enough to their life, that they should take an hour, drive somewhere, or whatever, show up and hear about something. Is it because you have a winning team? Is you have a popular professor? Is it something that you're doing is impacting them? Once you get to the measurement part of it, I think you have to look at who's coming. Are people coming to a lot of the same kind of events? Are people showing up and never coming to something else again? You have to think about the data mining part of it and really what you're trying to get out of those events. If it's just to kind of pull people together, a sense of community, that's one thing. But I think especially some of the work that these guys have both done on data mining around events and participation is pretty interesting. One of my questions always is, can you do like one or two less things per year and take those resources in that time and put it towards understanding more about what the things that you're doing? So if you did 100 things, can you do 98 and take those 2 events worth of time and say, let's mine this data more deeply and figure out exactly what the right mix is?
Andy, Heath Bowman from the Arkansas Alumni Association wanted us to talk a little bit about the traditional chapter model, and something that Charlie just said kind of struck me as far as whether it needs to change or how it's changing or what the model for the future looks like. Would you agree with Charlie's sentiment that maybe if our clubs or chapters organize less events during the course of the year and really focused in on a few, or maybe we focused in our efforts on a few chapters as far as helping them, that alumni, the engagement would increase?
This is so important. I think, first of all, that Charlie's actually the source of a strong influence on my thinking about this, going back probably about 3 or 4 years at the Case Summit. Charlie was on a panel, and somebody was asking a question about Facebook and ROI. And Charlie sort of said, look, don't worry so much about return on investment. We're all so worried about getting 2 more events done, or 10 more people to each event, or just that incremental increase to always kind of get 1 more. Charlie, you made the point that I thought was critical, and I had sort of an aha moment. He said, look, what about return on attention? ROA, he called it. I don't know if you remember this, Charlie. But Charlie said that return on attention. We've already got these people who have joined our LinkedIn group. They already attend our events. They already are donors and so on. We just say, oh, thank you, and then we move on to try to get 1 more. What about making the experience of the people who we know are engaged, however we define that, even richer, even more satisfying, connecting them even more deeply so that their relationship will be more effective for them and for the institution, and it will be longer lasting and so on. And I think that's a critical factor, because we tend to get caught up in sort of growing, wider and wider and broader, when we can also go deeper and deeper, and we need to pause and kind of ask, where are the areas in which we can go more deeper? Related to that is something that Andrew said a minute ago when he said value in the network is subjective. That means different things to different people at different times. I think by the same notion, I think our data, some of the surveys we've done in the last year suggest that engagement is very subjective too. We have an institutional definition of engagement. We say, well, you're engaged if you do this, 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 and this. But when you talk to alumni, they may not do all of those things, but they feel really engaged. They're loyal, they're supportive, they're attentive, but from our definition, they're a little bit passive. So I think we actually have to come to a more common understanding about what we mean by engagement. And that's one of the things I said in the blog post, which was that we need a methodology. What I mean by that is not a system for measuring stuff. I mean a foundation that we agree is a good starting point for measuring stuff. And we don't have that yet, because we're just starting this conversation.
That means everything that you just said makes me jump back to the beginning of the conversation about kind of alumni engagement or alumni relations and fundraising, and are they 2 things, are they 1 thing, are they a shoe and a glove? And I think a lot of it, they're the same thing, and a lot of the principles are the same, and everything you're just saying makes me think about that person who attends their first event, and do we have a stewardship model for things that aren't giving? Does someone, when they show up at their first event, do they get something? When someone shows up to a lot of events, do they get something? Or how are we treating people who do things other than giving? And I think once you blend these models together, you start not just looking at, from our standpoint, through a common lens, people start looking at us through a common lens. And I think that's nothing but good.
Andrew, is that fair to say that it's about what we can give our alumni? As far as making it worth their while to be involved in, are the social media platforms, the right components? Obviously, you have to factor them into the equation. But is that a commodity now? I mean, is social media no longer an effective tool, or is it sort of a must-use tool?
That's an interesting question. I think it is as much of a must-use tool as a telephone or a computer. Whether or not you're going to get anything out of that depends entirely on how you use it. I do think that one of the tensions that we see in the social space is institutions that are used to a highly centralized command and control model of communication, where they tell people what they think is important, and that's pretty much the end of the conversation. That simply doesn't work on the social web. Getting back to this return on attention question, you can't get any return if you don't have attention to start with, right? And our experience has been, when generating content for the social channels, that if we aren't highly attuned and responsive to what it is that people are telling us what they want by engaging with us back when we put it out there, we lose their attention, and then we sort of foreclose on the possibility of getting any sort of return to start with. So the issue of whether or not there can be an ROI from social media, that has nothing to do with the platforms themselves. It has everything to do with how you use them and your ability to recognize that in this particular space, we are not in the driver's seat. We are guests at a table that has many more of the alumni than staff members who are trying to work with the alumni. And if we can't adapt ourselves to their priorities, their norms, their values, and their expectations for engagement, we're not going to get anywhere.
And we also, by not doing, we also send the signal that we only show up when there's something in it for us.
Right.
If you're not contributing to the vitality of the network and bringing something interesting, then you don't really have a place in it. It's not like everything you just said. It's not our network. It's the network, and we're a part of it. We might be the biggest part of it, kind of growth-wise, but if you're just showing up when you need something, then people are going to stop hanging out with you.
I think that social media is a metaphor for that, in the sense that we're not the source of all the content, right? We're just another person in the conversation that we can participate in or not as we choose. But when we do, it's going to have to be as an equal, not as a broadcaster, the way it used to be. And I think in terms of the network, that's what I meant when I said our job is to kind of participate as one member of the network, contribute to it in the same way that an individual would put two people together who are going to benefit from connecting with each other, and then get out of the way, let them do their thing, and then move on to help someone else solve another problem. I think these things are all related.
And I'd love to take this opportunity to jump in and make a pitch for having recognition that higher ed can, in fact, produce content that's fun. I think one of the ways that we are artificially limiting our capacity to make it easy for people to engage with us is our neurotic insistence that content that we put out there somehow has to be appropriately high-toned, it's got to be morally improving, it's got to evoke the world-changing work that our students and our alumni are doing. And don't get me wrong, that stuff is really, really, really important, but we all tend to do that type of communication really, really, really well. And I tend to think of the social web as an opportunity for us to play with the alums and have fun and do the nostalgia thing and engage in a way that is pretty darn alien to most of our historical habits of communication from the mothership to the folks who are out there in orbit. I don't know if many of you followed the very interesting grad student sit-in that took place at the University of Houston over the past couple of weeks. It was sort of a week-long or a month-long campaign, basically asking for increases in the teaching stipends for the graduate students, and it involved a sit-in and a lot of sort of classical activism. But they made really, really interesting use of not only social media technologies but techniques to keep the pressure on, and one of the things that they used to great effect was memes, right? People love memes. Look at your Facebook newsfeed, and there are memes coming through every single day, and these guys seized on the use of memes to mock the explanations of the administration as to why things couldn't change, and they kept these circulating constantly, and it was effective. It kept people's attention. We've played around a little bit with memes, and people love it. That gets some of our highest level engagement. And it seems to me that we're really putting on blinders and limiting what we can accomplish if we don't pay attention to what it is that the people who are on the social web want to do with each other and articulate what we're trying to do in those terms.
And Andy, it kind of sounds like Andrew's saying, news doesn't really work as alumni engagement, and that we actually have to have a take on something or say something compelling that may spark a provocative reaction, positive or negative, and a great alumni engagement on the web really harnesses the power of that conversation to get people talking. Is that fair?
I think that's one dimension of it. It goes back to my comment before about having a definition of engagement. Even if we don't all have the same definition, that's okay. But for our own institution, we need to be clear what we are talking about as an alumni relations team, as an advancement team, as an educational institution when we say engagement. So what's the goal for interacting with our alumni at all? Is it only to get them to give? If that's our definition of engagement, then we can measure different forms of output and see what it results in. If we have multiple definitions, then we need to track them separately. That's fine as long as we have a consistent definition over time so we can find out, is the needle moving on our dashboard? Are we engaging more people? The people who we are we engaging them more effectively? What is the definition of effective engagement? We don't have the answers to a lot of these questions because our starting point is so vague and kind of ill-defined. The definition of engagement will tell you what forms of interaction are going to be the most effective. In some cases, it will be provocative content that generates a lot of comments, shares, likes, retweets. In other cases, it can be relatively passive from our point of view, and a story about the institution. You know, I agree with Andrew. We tend to be a little too serious in the way that we package things and deliver them, but that doesn't mean that we don't want people to know about the amazing things the students and the faculty and the researchers and the alumni are all doing. We absolutely do want people to know that, and that's one part and one dimension of this overall engagement animal that we're sort of trying to corral.
So if I could jump in, there's another important dimension to the issue of the relationship between engagement and effectiveness, and that's a time dimension, right? So I had a conversation today with somebody we were talking about the relationship between social media and fundraising. And his point was very directly that if the only metric that matters to me is fundraising, I'm not going to have a social media team. I'm going to hire another Major Gifts fundraiser who's going to get out there and who's going to give me more of a this fiscal year or this quarter bump in terms of direct fiscal return on the dollars invested in the staff. But the point that he was making is that it's great that you guys are figuring out ways that you can support the fundraising, but we're really depending on you to do things like populating the pipeline, keeping people's attention engaged so that when the time comes for conversations to start about higher level giving or their philanthropic interests, they're still plugged in and we don't have to make cold calls and try to get in the door when they've been focused on other nonprofits for the past 15 or 20 years, right? So engagement today may not pay dividends for another 15 or 20 years, and as we're trying to grapple with how we measure this, we have to be attuned to that long time span.
That's kind of interesting too, because it kind of, to me, brings up the question of does there need to be a common funnel through which engagement happens? Because if that alum really cares about mechanical engineering, as long as we have ways to keep people engaged with the ideas and people who are driving mechanical engineering things on campus, is there kind of an official alumni role? You know, I mean, can engagement be far broader and really be a lot more free-flowing? And we're kind of helping to build and support the systems that make it happen, but we don't necessarily need to like run it. It's kind of an interesting question.
Myself, guys, when I try to tie the thread as to what engagement means to me, I tend to think of the word advice the most often. If I'm going to participate in a networking event, I hope I'm going to form a relationship over the course of time with folks in the room who eventually can offer me advice to help me get a better job or to become a better leader or to find myself in a better place, what have you. What do you guys think of the role of advice in terms of replicating the act of networking when it comes to content, advice-based content, versus that's sort of the role of all those events we're doing, is to put people in the room, get them talking, and hope they tell each other good stuff that makes them better professionals underneath the flag. I'll throw it. Anyone can grab that one.
Well, this isn't a direct answer, but my immediate response to the question is that we can turn ourselves inside out, trying to provide frameworks within which people can ask for advice and help themselves out. But if they don't step forward to take advantage of those networks, we're not going to get anywhere. I'm thinking about this because one of the missed opportunities that I see most frequently from a staff perspective is the large numbers of alumni career services volunteers who I've seen at all of the institutions I've both worked at and studied at, who would love nothing more than to help fellow alumni and help students, and they've put their names in the hat. They said, go ahead, contact me, and they very rarely are contacted, right? So I don't see that there's anything that we can do from a central perspective that will force people to step forward and access these resources in a way that's going to make this sort of advice taking possible. I mean, part of this has to be on the shoulders of the individual alums.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right, and that's again another version of this kind of latent aspect of the network value. You know, it's there, and when someone needs it, if it's easy for them to access and find and query, then it will have value to them and they'll use it. And our role isn't to force people. I don't think there's any reason to ask people, well, I don't think we need to ask alumni, would you be willing to serve as a resource to students or alumni who want to know about it? 99.9% of the alumni are going to say, sure, why not? Yeah, I'd like to. So this idea that we have like a separate career directory somehow that's only people who volunteered to provide advice, everybody should be in there by default, and then we should have them opt out. That's my opinion. Mm-hmm. You know, and you'll get a couple of % of people who say like, no, I don't want to be contacted, or you know, for some other reason they might not want to participate. The vast majority will do so. The trick is to make them feel like they understand what you said a minute ago about the long-term nature of this. This is, engagement is not something that we're going to be able to report on this month accurately and then assess our programming as on that basis. This is something that if we do it right, 5, 10, 15 years from now, we'll start to recognize some of the long-term benefit of creating a network, of engaging students and alumni in ways that are meaningful to them, and then we'll know that we succeeded. It's frustrating because you don't have a short-term metric, but that may be the nature of the beast.
Yeah, and I think, you know, Andrew and then Charlie, in Andy's article, it gets back to that finding of the hybrid solution that you know, starts to match up statistics with the overall big picture evidence of engagement is happening over time, and that work is yielding results. You know, what are some of your ideas as far as the most important components of measuring? If you had to package it up, I mean, if you had to come up with a couple of things that this is what we need to measure over the short term and the long term, you know, what does that look like?
So I can throw 2 examples in there. When I got to Cornell, I felt like the work planning process was extremely paper intensive and process driven and burdensome. And over time, I have come to love it because it forces you to think about that very question. So I have 2 examples, and I think that from a big picture perspective, what my team is trying to do as we think these issues through is we're trying to figure out ways that we can quantify the extent to which our efforts are helping alumni affairs and development as a whole work towards goals that are set forth in the divisional strategic plan, which we check in to orient ourselves to every year. So 2 examples. One of them is that there is a top-level presidential initiative to internationalize Cornell. And the way that renders in an alumni affairs world is that we need to internationalize our alumni outreach and engagement efforts. So we set our data tracking for our live streaming efforts to measure this. And as a result of that, I can say with 100% certainty that our efforts in FY12 engaged an additional 19,632 individuals living in 102 countries. Period. That's it. That's the elevator speech. What was your impact last year? This was it. Boom. Very clear, and it's not something that we're trying to define internally in terms of social media, but it's something that lines up directly with this institutional priority. So it's a question of framing it. The other example has to do with relating our work to the fundraising goals. And remember, we're a very conscious hybrid organization in which all parts of the organization are oriented towards this fundraising goal. We've been working for about 1.5 years at this point on this attempt to do data mining on LinkedIn, recognizing that it's still difficult to raise money in social media. We're focusing our attention on finding money on social media. So we've developed a process that we apply when alumni ask to join the main LinkedIn group, and we, making a long story short, we apply a filter that lets us identify whether or not this is somebody who ought to be looked at by the research staff. By doing this, we can say, once again, with complete certainty that over the past 9 months, we have added an additional 100 or so people to the pool, 50% of whom have been assessed by research at a major gifts level or above, right? So we're not directly raising money, but everybody concedes that populating that pipeline is important. And the best gift officer in the world isn't going to be able to do anything without prospects with which to work, right? So we're thinking very hard about how we can leverage aspects of these tools to contribute to that bottom line, even if we can't do a direct one-to-one we were soliciting on social media. And everybody understands the importance of prospects, and that's worked really well for us in terms of explaining how our work interfaces with the organization and the impact we have.
Charlie, is measuring alumni engagement about kind of building on top of wins year over year, but then sort of associating prospect development with alumni engagement?
Yeah, I mean, as Andrew's talking, you started with the hybrid thing, so I go to cars, and I think everything he talked about was great because it's like dashboard material. How is the machine working? What's the institutional health picture look like? And each of his things tied up to something bigger. I think that's one of the big challenges in this area. It's a big challenge, metrics and measurement-wise, period. That are we measuring things that ultimately lead to institutional or somehow positively impacts institutional vitality? If so, if not, then you probably want to measure something else. And if the thing you're measuring doesn't really contribute to it, then it's probably not something we're talking about. Whether it's a divisional strategic plan or the institution strategic plan, it somehow has to ladder up. I think that's good for the work. It's also good for the professional, that you could see as you're doing your thing that can sometimes seem mundane. You feel like somehow it's helping the place you work. I think people feel better about that. I think the peril that we see sometimes is that the measurement becomes about the thing. And when alumni engagement becomes about alumni engagement, that's a little scary. That's like kind of checking the tire pressure on the car that has no engine. You got to make sure that what you're doing is connected to everything else.
Is that a hybrid car, Charles? To go back, I mean, like, it's also important in this same context to separate inputs from outputs. That you can say, so Andrew gave a good example that the streaming video effort reached this many people in this many countries. If I'm the boss, I might say, that's great. What happened as a result of reaching all those people with streaming video? You know what I mean? So I'm tempted to think of that as an input and try to draw a line, probably a dotted line, not a causation, probably a correlation, with some outcome that's directly associated with things that we know we can measure in the shorter term. So I think the surfacing of major gift prospects through the LinkedIn screening process that Andrew referred to, something Cornell is doing that at Carnegie Mellon we're probably going to jump into and do as well. That's much more directly related to outcomes I can track in the short run that have tangible, measurable things. I did notice, I just want to say one thing, I noticed on the Twitter feed, for example, right now, a couple of people have mentioned, yeah, we know about this, but the thing is it's so hard to measure engagement. It's so hard to measure. For people who have this issue, I would suggest a resource that might help your thinking about it. A colleague of mine here at Carnegie Mellon in Advancement, Jim McNulty, mentioned to me a book by Douglas Hubbard that's called How to Measure Anything. And it is not necessarily as simple to apply his commentary and findings as I wish it were, but it's very useful to help think about things that it's very hard, that we think it's hard to measure, how you might go about measuring them. And he has a very interesting definition of measurement. He says measurement is any reduction in uncertainty about what you want to know. And if you start from the point of view that if you can reduce the uncertainty about what you're trying to find out at all, right there, by definition, you've done some measuring. It helps get off the dime. It helps you overcome that inertia that makes you feel like this is too hard. You can do it. There are ways to approach it, and it takes a little creative thinking. Chapters 3 and 4 of that book, How to Measure Anything, have some things that I think might spur the thinking of advancement professionals in this area if they're having trouble kind of getting their head around that.
Andy, kind of a final thought for the show tonight as we're approaching the 8 o'clock hour. You know, you kind of end your piece about talking through applying hard data with reflection and experience. Are you talking about storytelling? What stories do we know about what's happening after the events occur? Two people met, a relationship flourished. And are we talking about those stories that complement the data for events or giving history?
It's interesting. I think from my point of view, that kind of story, that anecdotal history is a way of modeling something really important, which is the behavior that you want to encourage and that you want to sort of propagate across your network. Earlier when Andrew was talking about social media, and he made a comment about, look, it's not really about the platform. It's not about the social media tool or the website. It's actually more about the people and what they're doing. And I think that's a key point, which is we get so caught up in like, oh, should we have a Pinterest strategy, and do I need to have a Google Plus policy, and what's our Facebook plan? If you put aside the tools and you focus on the human behavior that the tools enable, you're getting at the core of what our job and our profession probably really ought to be about, which is connecting people with each other and with the institution in ways that are relevant and meaningful to them. And it sounds simple and it sounds obvious. It's hard, yes. It requires some sophisticated thinking and some reflection. I think that equation that I quoted in the blog post, experience plus reflection equals understanding, is not mine. I took that from Stefan Collini, who wrote the book I mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, What Are Universities For? And he was talking about it in the form of the importance of balancing your data and your analysis and your kind of quantitative measurement on one hand with what you know about the way things are from your experience on the other hand. And so on the one hand you have measurement, on the other hand you have judgment. Your judgment should be professional and rigorous, but if you mix that with some of the data, now you've got that hybrid solution that accounts for both the qualitative, anecdotal, historical understanding and the analytical, quantitative, numerical analysis. And those two things together will get you where you want to be.
That was a perfect ending. Guys, thank you so much for being on the show tonight. It was a pleasure to listen to you guys and to get the chance to ask you the questions. I think I'm certain that everybody out there enjoyed it just looking at the Twitter feed tonight. And again, I want to, on behalf of everybody out there, thank Charlie, Andy, and Andrew for joining tonight on Higher Ed Live. From Charlottesville, Virginia, I'm Ryan Catherwood. Thanks a lot for joining us. And next week, join host Jeff Stevens as he takes a chomp out of Higher Ed Web, Florida. I think that's a gator joke or something. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.